never thought I would be standing on my son's doorstep, suitcase in hand, feeling like a stranger. At 67, with nothing left but the clothes I could gather, I had imagined that Brian would pull me into his arms, that his home would be a place of refuge after the storm ripped through my life. Instead, I felt the chill of his distance before he even opened the door fully. He looked at me, not with warmth, but with unease. His words were clipped, cold, almost rehearsed. He spoke of privacy, of space, of how their home wasn't the right place for me to stay. And there I was, his mother, still carrying the weight of fresh grief from losing my husband. Now carrying another wound, this one delivered by the very child I had raised. It's a strange kind of pain, the kind that doesn't make you cry right away, but leaves you hollow, as if your chest has been carved out. I stood there, hearing the finality in his voice, and for the first time, I realized that love isn't always returned in equal measure. My daughter-in-law, Sophie, stood behind him, her silence saying more than words ever could. It was clear I was not welcome. I turned away, my suitcase suddenly feeling heavier than I could manage. Every step down that walkway was a battle between pride and despair. How does a mother process being unwanted by her only son? I told myself to keep breathing, to hold my head up. But inside, I was unraveling. That rejection didn't come out of nowhere. It was piled on top of something even more devastating. Just days before, I had lost the very roof over my head, the place where my memories lived. The tornado had taken it all. And maybe to understand how I ended up here, you need to know how that day unfolded. It started out like any other Tuesday. I was in the kitchen, standing by the window, making tea the way I always did around 3 in the afternoon. The day felt ordinary, almost comforting in its routine. But then I noticed the light shift in a way that unsettled me. The sky outside turned from bright spring blue to a strange, heavy green, almost bruised. The air felt thick, charged, like the whole world was holding its breath. At first, I brushed it off. Kansas weather had always been unpredictable, and I'd lived through my share of thunderstorms. But when the sirens wailed, their cry piercing through my little house, my heart began to pound. The radio crackled with a warning. I'll never forget there was a large tornado on the ground, moving straight toward my neighborhood. 10 minutes. That's all I had. 10 minutes to decide what mattered most in a lifetime. I grabbed an old suitcase from the closet. My hands shook so badly I could barely work the zipper. I didn't reach for clothes or food. I reached for memory, my wedding photo with Michael, Brian's baby pictures, my mother's pearl necklace, a few papers I knew I couldn't replace. Everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the books I'd collected over decades, I left behind. How do you reduce 40 years of life to what fits in one small bag? There's no right way. The basement was cold and smelled faintly of damp earth. I crouched in the corner, clutching Michael's worn sweater, listening as the storm grew near. The sound was like a freight train barreling through the walls, a roar so loud it made the air itself vibrate. The house shuddered above me, groaning against the force of nature. Wood splintered, glass shattered. I prayed, not for the house, but simply to live through it. And then, suddenly, silence. A silence so deep it made my ears ring. When I climbed the steps, my legs were trembling. I opened the basement door and stepped into a world unrecognizable. Where my living room once stood, there was open sky. The roof was gone. The walls were half collapsed. My rose garden looked as though a giant hand had crushed it. The kitchen table, where Brian used to do his homework, was lodged in the broken remains of the garage. I walked through the wreckage in a daze, clutching that single suitcase like it was a lifeline. The insurance man came the next day, snapping photos and speaking numbers in a flat voice, but I barely heard him. To him, it was just another claim. To me, it was 40 years of love and labor reduced to rubble. When he said total loss, the words sank in. He was right. My home was gone. That night, I sat in the borrowed car a neighbor had loaned me, staring at 3 garbage bags of clothes and that battered suitcase. It hit me then. With full force, I was homeless. I had nowhere to go but to my son. And so, with trembling hope, I turned the key in the ignition and drove toward Brian's house, praying he would open the door. I remember driving toward Brian's house with my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself this was just temporary, that a mother always had a place with her son. After all, I had raised him in love and sacrifice. Now, with my home torn apart by the storm, I needed him more than ever. The closer I got to his neighborhood, the more I felt out of place. Wide streets stretched out in perfect symmetry. Lawns were manicured like something out of a magazine, trimmed and green as if no hardship could ever touch them. Every house looked polished, windows shining, porches lined with fresh flowers. When I pulled into Brian's driveway, the contrast hit me like a punch. His house stood tall with crisp white shutters and a bold red door. It was spotless, beautiful, everything my own home had once been before the storm ripped it away. Meanwhile, I stepped out of the car in shoes still dusted with mud, carrying 3 garbage bags and 1 battered suitcase. My clothes smelled faintly of mildew, and I was painfully aware of how I looked. I told myself it didn't matter. He was my son. Family saw past those things. When Brian opened the door, for a split second, I saw the boy I had raised, the smile I had once known. But behind him, Sophie appeared almost instantly. She looked perfect, with her blonde hair swept up in one of those buns that take more time than they admit, wearing white jeans and a silk blouse. Her eyes went straight to the bags at my feet, then back to me. I explained softly that I just needed a place to stay until the insurance cleared and I could find an apartment. I told myself he would say yes. That of course his home was my home. But the air shifted in that room. Brian's voice took on a tone I had only ever heard in business meetings, rehearsed and polite. Sophie spoke too, with a careful smile, explaining how they valued their privacy, how their house was their sanctuary. My own son suggested I might be more comfortable at an extended stay hotel. He even offered to help with a little money to get me started, as if I were a stranger passing through. The words cut deeper than the storm that had taken my house. Privacy. That was the reason my only child couldn't offer me a bed under his roof. In that moment, I realized I was not welcome. Not here. Not home. I gathered my bags with hands that shook, thanked them out of habit, and walked back to the car. My throat burned, but I swallowed the tears until I was alone again. I drove aimlessly until I found myself in the far corner of a Walmart parking lot. As the sun set behind rows of shopping carts and flickering lights, I leaned my seat back, clutching my suitcase like a shield. That night, I faced the truth I hadn't wanted to admit. I had no home. My son had closed his door to me. And so, I prepared to spend the night in my car. The first night in my car was the hardest. I leaned the seat back and tried to convince myself it was only temporary, that I'd figure something out in the morning. But every time headlights swept across the windshield or a security truck rolled by, my chest tightened with fear. I barely slept. When the sun came up, my neck ached, my back throbbed, and I felt older than my years. By the second night, the shock had faded into something heavier. Hunger gnawed at me, and I bought a gas station sandwich that tasted like cardboard. I ate it slowly, ashamed of how grateful I felt for something so cheap. I brushed my teeth in a McDonald's bathroom, avoiding the glances of strangers. Their pity was worse than their judgment. I wanted to disappear. By the third night, I could smell myself stale clothes, damp with sweat, the faint sourness of exhaustion. I washed my face in public restrooms, splashed water on my arms, and told myself I still had dignity. But when I caught my reflection in a cracked mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. I had once been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone with a home. Now, I was just a tired old woman in a parking lot, trying not to be noticed. I kept my purse close, rummaging through it when the nights felt endless. That's when I found it. A small, faded business card, tucked into a corner like it had been waiting for me all these years. The edges were soft from decades of being carried. Richard Hayes, my first love. My hand shook as I traced the ink, remembering the way he used to laugh, the way his voice had once been the sound of safety to me. On the back, in my own teenage handwriting, were 4 words, "Don't forget me." For a long time, I sat there in the silence of the car, the card resting in my palm. It seemed ridiculous. 50 years had passed. He had surely built a life, a family, a world without me. Yet, in that moment, when I had nothing left, his name felt like a lifeline. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone. I hesitated, telling myself not to hope, not to expect anything. But with trembling fingers, I dialed the number, whispering his name like a prayer. When I finally pressed the last number and lifted the phone to my ear, my hands were trembling so badly, I thought I might drop it. I told myself not to expect anything, that the number might not even work anymore. But after the second ring, a voice answered. It was deeper now, seasoned by years, but still achingly familiar. In that instant, I felt 17 again. When I said my name, there was silence for a breath, then a softness that told me he remembered. He didn't hesitate. He said he was coming. I sat in that parking lot, staring at the faded lines on the pavement, my heart hammering. Shame pressed down on me. I looked at my wrinkled clothes, the bags piled around me, the gray in my hair. What would he think of me now, this tired woman living out of a car? Part of me wanted to disappear before he arrived. But another part, the part still holding on to hope, kept whispering that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I thought. 2 hours stretched like an eternity. The Walmart lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the lot. Every time a car turned in, my breath caught. And then, at last, a silver sedan slowed, scanning the rows. When he stepped out, I recognized him instantly. His hair was silver now, his face lined, but his eyes, the same storm gray eyes I had memorized long ago, met mine and softened. He walked toward me with steady steps, and when he reached me, I saw no judgment in his expression, only kindness, only warmth. He opened the car door for me as if I were still someone worth caring for, then lifted my battered suitcase and bags as though they were treasures. The contrast between his quiet dignity and my son's cold rejection pierced me, but it also healed something broken inside me. The drive to his home felt unreal. We passed through iron gates and up a winding drive lined with tall oaks. His house was elegant but not showy, stone walls and wide porches that seemed built to last. When he showed me to the guest room, a space larger than my old living room, I stood there frozen, afraid to disturb anything. He simply smiled and told me I was safe now. For the first time since the tornado, I let myself believe it. The first weeks in Richard's home felt like stepping into a life I never thought I'd touch again. We settled into a rhythm that was gentle and reassuring. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, watching the sun climb through the trees. I cooked sometimes, though Richard insisted I didn't have to. And together, we laughed at my attempts to remember old recipes. Evenings were slower books, soft music, the comfort of someone simply being there. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking in panic. In those quiet moments, I felt valued again. Richard asked about my thoughts, my memories, even my fears. He made me feel as if my life still mattered, not just to me, but to him. It was a healing I hadn't realized I needed so badly. But peace has a way of drawing shadows. Not long after I settled in, my phone began to buzz more often. Brian's name lit up the screen with sudden regularity. His voice carried a new sweetness, laced with apologies and promises that felt rehearsed. He asked how I was, but his questions always circled back to Richard, what he did for a living, how big the house was, whether Richard was comfortable. Sophie followed close behind with packages arriving at the door, candles I never lit, scarves still wrapped in tissue, cards signed with words that rang hollow. Each gesture felt more like an investment than an act of love, as if they were buying their way back into my life now that there was wealth involved. I wanted to believe my son was reaching out from guilt or love, but the timing made the truth clear. He hadn't called when I was sleeping in a Walmart parking lot. He hadn't reached out when I was hungry or cold. Only now, surrounded by Richard's kindness and stability, did he remember to be a son? The realization settled heavy in my chest. Richard noticed too. He said little, but I caught the look in his eyes when he saw Brian's name flashing on my phone, or when he placed Sophie's unopened gifts aside. It wasn't anger, but a quiet recognition. He knew what was happening, even before I could bring myself to admit it out loud. And so the warmth of my new life began to mix with a growing tension, one that would come to a head soon enough over dinner. The night of the dinner carried a weight I could feel in my chest. Richard had insisted we invite Brian and Sophie, and though I smiled and set the table, my hands trembled as I laid the silverware down. I feared what would be said, what would be revealed, and whether I would once again be placed in the role of burden. When they arrived, everything looked perfect. Richard greeted them warmly, his voice calm, his gestures steady. Sophie came in with another gift bag, all ribbons and bright colors, while Brian's eyes darted around the house, lingering on the paintings, the polished wood, the quiet elegance of the dining room. I noticed how little he looked at me. The meal began with small talk, the clinking of forks against plates, and Sophie's endless chatter about vacations she wanted to take. Brian asked Richard questions about investments, about the house, about his lifestyle, as if each word were a key probing for a hidden door. I sat silently, my appetite dulled by dread, watching my son speak with a smoothness that had never been directed toward me. It was Richard who broke the rhythm. His voice was steady, almost gentle, Yet there was a firmness underneath that left no space for misunderstanding. He spoke of how family is tested not in moments of abundance, but in moments of loss. He laid bare the truth that when my home lay in ruins and I knocked on my son's door, I was turned away in the name of privacy. And now, when I was no longer destitute, my son appeared with open arms, bearing gifts and smiles that had been absent when they were most needed. The room fell silent. Sophie looked down, fiddling with her napkin, and Brian's face flushed red, though no words came to defend him. I felt my breath catch, not from shame this time, but from relief. For once, I wasn't forced to justify my own worth. Someone else, someone who loved me, had spoken the truth aloud. In that stillness, I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer a burden. I was a woman whose dignity had been defended, and whose story mattered. The silence hung there, heavy but liberating, marking the beginning of a new chapter that neither Brian nor Sophie could control. When the house grew quiet after that dinner, I finally felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. The storm inside me had settled, and for the first time since the tornado, I could breathe without feeling like the ground was about to vanish beneath my feet. What Richard did that night wasn't just about calling out my son's behavior, it was about showing me that my dignity was worth defending. I used to measure my value by how much I could hold my family together, even when it left me broken. Losing my home, being turned away, sleeping in my car, all of that nearly convinced me that I didn't matter anymore. But sitting across from Richard and hearing the firmness in his voice as he stood for me, I realized something I had forgotten. I am not disposable. I am not less deserving of love or respect just because I grew older, or because I needed help. These days, I wake up in a home where I feel safe. I share coffee with someone who listens to me, who treats me as a partner, not as a burden. Richard and I have built small routines that make the days gentle again, and I no longer spend my nights wondering if I will be forgotten. My son may still circle with his hollow words and insincere gestures, but I no longer chase after scraps of affection. My heart has learned to rest where kindness lives. If there's one thing I want to leave you with, it's this: life can strip everything away in an instant, but it can also hand you a second chance when you least expect it. Don't let betrayal convince you that you are unworthy. Choose to stand where love, dignity, and respect surround you. And never be afraid to start again. If my story touched you, I'd love to hear yours. Share your thoughts, your reflections, maybe even a moment when life surprised you with a second chance. And if you believe this message might help someone else, please like, share, and leave a comment below.